often you hear, or are told, or are advised, perhaps after a relationship that ended badly, to think more about yourself, become selfish. Now, does thinking more about yourself mean being more selfish? I mean, is there a relationship between the two things? So, this apparent equivalence hides a complexity that goes far beyond the simplification with which we tend to approach it in everyday life. Perhaps, I would say, individualism as a concept has somehow been misunderstood. So, the term individualism first appeared in 1851 in Mill's writings regarding a social philosophy that favors non-interference by the government in the lives of individuals. However, individualism, in its most popular sense, is a concept that emerged and was strongly felt in the 1980s alongside the aggressive consumer society and status symbols, suggesting that the individual wanted or needed to stand out from the crowd with an ambition that somehow also involved a certain degree of immorality, amorality, or cynicism in the way others could be used to achieve this emergence. A phenomenology of individualism that seems to have little to do with cultivating one's individual peculiarities, one's, so to speak, creative identity, and more to do with a certain narcissistic approach to living. So what happened? What happened is that the laxity of authority did not facilitate the genesis of a man better developed in his freedoms, but of a man-child who aspires to comfort, even at the expense of others, and who, above all, constructs his identity not on human models, but on immaterial models, namely the object, the good, the status, the possession of which gives meaning to individuality. However, in the pursuit of goods as a means of identity, it's obvious that the uniqueness of the individual goes out the window, given that the path is one of homogenization. So we have a conformity disguised as self-determination, a standardized individualism, an oxymoron, that has become a social reality. What was supposed to be a movement of liberation for the individual from the authoritarian father and the state, which as its extension in some way, has turned into a race towards homogenization that, instead of expressing our uniqueness, makes us all surprisingly similar. And I am not, evidently, the only one who has noticed this. For example, the South Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han, in his writing The Burnout Society, states that contemporary individualism has produced a type of person, called the performance subject, who, believing they are asserting their freedom, ends up self-exploiting in the name of ideals that do not truly belong to them. That is, they end up relinquishing this role to the objects they purchase, allowing these objects to define their identity. And since the value of these objects as status symbols increases proportionally to the number of people who recognize this value, either because they own them or desire them, our individualities become herd-like and unoriginal. Individualism, therefore, which in a positive sense we might define or understand as self-awareness, transforms into a disconnection from oneself in favor of a burdensome connection with something external to us, whose presence or absence modulates our sense of self. The psychologist Abraham Maslow, known for the famous pyramid, had intuited this paradox when he spoke about the difference between deficiency needs and growth needs. The former push us towards acquiring what others have, while the latter drive us towards realizing what we are authentically called to become. Moreover, this consumerist individualism has consistently transformed human relationships into objects of consumption as well. But let's go back to the beginning. So is paying attention to oneself automatically an act of selfishness? So, this narrative that leads to considering attention to oneself as something morally questionable has been fueled over the centuries by religion and by certain political positions, or by people who have made their peculiar position or existential realization a universal model, but always somewhat tinged, I would say, with guilt and harsh judgments for those who do not commit to self-sacrifice. And yet, in terms of psychological well-being, the ability to express one's needs and to define one's boundaries represents not an act of closure, but of genuine openness, meaning that in a relationship, the sincere expression of oneself constitutes the first act of love, not only towards truth as an abstract concept, but also towards the other person. That is, when we allow someone to truly know us, we offer the possibility, the freedom for this person to consciously choose if and how to engage in the relationship. This transparency of showing oneself in the sunlight and not hiding in the shadow of others' needs is not selfishness, but a profound respect for the other person's decision-making autonomy. Moreover, the time dedicated to oneself, as long as it doesn't completely consume the time dedicated to relationships, becomes a moment of direct construction of the US, because a couple cannot thrive if the individualities of its members are lost and nullified within it. Therefore, in summary, and to conclude, we can assert that our society is not truly individualistic, or at least not in the noblest sense of the term, since expressing one's individual needs and taking care of oneself does not equate to being selfish. Existential assertiveness, that is, the ability to assert one's needs and boundaries, is not selfishness, but a prerequisite for genuine generosity. Only those who know what is important for themselves can offer it freely to others, without the resentment that arises from unprocessed sacrifices. True individualism, or the definition I would like to write for it, is not an enemy of human connection but its necessary condition. Selfishness, on the other hand, is not an authentic expression of oneself, but a distortion of one's individuality based on inauthentic needs, among which is devaluing others' perspectives. So, the challenge that arises in these years, I would say, is not the demand that all individual instances be accepted, and it cannot happen because we are 8 billion, but to find a balance between personal authenticity and relational harmony. It's not easy. The current socio-historical phase seems to me to be more about resentments and recriminations than a genuine search for harmony. See you next time.